There we go.
You have to do the chat tonight, they can kind of get it going.
This is the silence portion of it.
If Yolanda doesn't have to talk, what can you get?
I don't talk unless someone talks to me.
There you go. My mother told me when I was young, yeah, that's right.
It's a good labor-saving approach. Good labor-saving strategy. Frivolous. Yeah, I don't know if I'd call it context. Sure. If anything, I would say frivolous in that context would be anything other than radiant presence. Radiant presence is not frivolous; it's joyous, and it's completely liberating, but it's not frivolous.
So, can you give us an example of something that?
It's not radiant presence.
Anything that's not radiant presence.
Such as?
Yeah.
If there's anything in your experience that's not radiant presence, you're being frivolous by indulging it.
Oh, yeah.
So nothing.
Right.
You're in fact tempted.
Well, I mean, it has to do with being with that sense. I mean, not only for this with the relative.
A good word for another word for frivolous is self-importance.
Even more.
Well, they're one and the same, so it couldn't really be worse.
Yeah. But self-importance could also be radiant.
If it is, then it's not self-importance. Because in the radiance, there's no self.
There's no nothing.
There's no nothing.
So, you don't live like that. And what I'm saying
You don't live like what?
you don't live, okay, so the suggestion is, how is radiant presence always constant?
Try and find anything other than radiant presence. Try real hard. Anything can only be radiant presence if you imagine it to be so, and that imagining is well, it's worse than quixotic. It's self-defeating because radiant presence is the best of the best, and so if you're imagining it to be something else, the best you can possibly do is to diminish it. So what's the point?
Well, you gotta get there. Somehow, if you're not aware of that,
Right.
in the moment,
If you're not aware of it, get aware of it.
right. So getting aware of it seems to entail
That's it.
so you say just do it. Well, okay, so there's a reminder. I mean, if you're not there, if you're involved,
Yeah.
then there's a reminder.
For sure.
And it comes, I guess, as a thought, and it comes as a feeling, thought, and
Well, you don't need to find radiant presence. You need to let go of anything that's not radiant presence. Because radiant presence does itself. You don't need when you leave everything else, radiant presence is what's left over. So what you need a reminder of is is to notice when you seem to be with anything that seems to not be radiant presence. That's when the reminder has to be there, not of radiant presence, but of the apparent lack of radiant presence. And that will remind you to look and see what's really there, and then of course you'll find radiant presence, because what else would you find? Yeah, you don't need a concept of it. And the important thing to notice is when it seems to not be radiant presence. And then you're being frivolous. Or self-important, according to our previous.
Yeah. And say to yourself, oh, we're not being frivolous again. Or something.
You don't even need to say you're being it, just look what it really is. I mean, because being frivolous is, of course, radiant presence. So all one who has a certain skill as a yogi has to do is notice that it seems to not be radiant presence, and then you will notice that, oh, but it is radiant presence, and then problem solved, to the extent there was a problem.
I think I'm feeling this most.
For sure.
It's not always.
Yeah. And many sages throughout the ages have noticed something along those lines. That's part of the perks. It's the carrot on the string. You know?
Well, someone posted this video of Nityananda,
Sure.
in his little loincloth, like throughout his life. Where he just sort of stumbled from one place to another. It's like, how did this guy get to be so lucky? He just people followed his every move. And when he couldn't do anymore, he
you call that lucky?
Fly around.
Well,
It sort of means that the golf description.
Right.
Sort of like, how we live, she knew it at a very young age.
And Ananda's wonderful. I've got a link to him on my website too. Radiance intrinsically doesn't need anything. It doesn't need you to do anything. It doesn't need you to be anything. It doesn't even need you to be alive or be healthy. It just doesn't matter. And so once one really finds radiance, then what happens in terms of what one seems to be doing and behaving and all that is just what everyone's default nature is. But the radiance itself doesn't demand anything. It doesn't demand nothing either. So it's not like we need to stop doing. If one's nature is to do, then someone who's melted into the radiance will seem to be doing. Or if someone's nature is not to do, then one will just be lying around.
So awareness of it as opposed to melted into it sounds distinct.
Well, it's a difference. Yeah, it's a difference between. It's a difference. I guess you could say depth of realization or something. Splitting hairs. It's only, yeah, well, it's only relevant if it's relevant. It's relevant if it's relevant. If you're not melted in it, then you can work on that.
I mean, awareness seems to be the first,
Yeah. See? Awareness of radiance presence is the path and is the goal. And the very nature of what radiant presence is it deepens its being with itself. So awareness of radiant presence, then it's like grabbing onto an anvil in the ocean. It drags you down. So once you have awareness of radiant presence, it takes you where it's going, and it's just an infinite unfoldment from the opening into itself. And so the very trend, the very nature of it is to melt into itself continually, and progressively, more and more so, ongoingly, forever. So the whole trick is just take hold of that anvil.
well, the bliss is
Yeah, sure. The bliss is that what it keeps you like drags you grab the anvil. Oh yeah, no, it does all the work because it's seductive. It draws you to itself by its very nature. You know, it's not like something you need to do. You know, a taste of it, and it's like, oh my God, divine ambrosia. It's not like, oh gosh, I wonder if I want to get more. What are you, stupid? You fucking idiot?
There are people who seem to be stupid.
But I can only think that in that case, if the person just doesn't have a clear enough experience of it. I mean, I can't imagine. But, yeah, I know.
Well, that's what you found with anyway.
Oh, it's all karmic. Yeah, it's all karmic. Sure.
It seems to be kind of like an addiction.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. Illusion is very addictive. I mean, that's the whole problem.
Yeah.
To the extent there's a problem.
Yeah.
Yes.
Take a word.
I don't know.
I mean, like the drama, like people are addicted to drama. I just think it's
Seems to me like they're addicted to dating.
yeah, that too. Yeah.
It's addicted to delusion because there is no, I mean, the notion that there is a getting it right or there is a result, and that result could be correct or more or less correct is inaccurate.
Totally biased definition.
Exactly.
so you can't let them know it.
You can't know what. Know what? You can't know what. Sure you can.
Not in terms of understanding.
Not conceptually, certainly.
So you can't ever get it right.
Well, but by its very nature, it has no right. In any direct contact with it reveals that fact.
Just pull that. The rod hanging from the curtain.
Get it right.
How will I know when I get it?
People stop yelling at you.
Yeah, when you start yelling at yourself, you got it right.
It's a bit like an electric light switch. concepts are no like about.
Yeah. Self-verifying.
That's self-knowledge. So when you turn it off and then you start to find the light again.
Well, the motivation to turn it off is kind of good. There's a thing that every now and again I ponder, which is people's energy. I can see that we are all part of my hallucination. And when I look at people, I see a persistent energy. And yet, I don't know if it's their energy or mine. I mean, it's, they don't exist.
Yeah.
So
Qualifying is meaningless. What you're asking about is the nature of the patterns. The patterns.
It's the nature of the patterns.
Yeah, patterns have their own intrinsic nature, such as it is. And the nature, like all patterning, the nature is that patterning is both absolutely specific and absolutely infinite, absolutely indeterminate, simultaneously. So everything is exactly what it is to the extent anything is anything, and yet anything is also everything if you follow it that way. So, and this of course applies to people and oneself as a karmic pattern, so on and so forth. So every pattern has its very precise what we're talking about is what relates to the karma, of course, technically, which is the meaningfulness and the nature, the flavor of patterns, and the sort of, you could say, the destiny of patterns, or the nature of patterns to have the history that they have, which is part of their flavor. You could say part and parcel of their flavor. And it's a mystery that is so. There's the nature that they use to infinitely generate these apparent patterns with all these specificity. And that each pattern is the way it is in your experience, is your karma, paradoxically. Yes. And the way each pattern is in your experience is your karma. And so this pattern in your experience is different than this pattern in my experience, because your karma is different than my karma. The karma only applies to the patterns. It doesn't apply. Radiance has this very interesting nature of being totally, absolutely specific, absolutely differentiated, and simultaneously being transcendental, i.e. being everything. With no duality there, with a continuum of that condition, which of course is very illogical and irrational, but of course is the case. And the trick is to see that that's the case and not let yourself fall into a conceptual either or of, well, it either is specific or it's infinite, and then sort of, yo-yo back and forth between them. I mean, this, I think conceptually, or let's say philosophically, at this point, we've talked about it many, many times for years. This point is the real, the most challenging aspect of seeing what's going on here, because you have the fact that the patterning is intensely specific. I mean, every atom is exactly itself different from every other atom. Every being is exactly itself different from every other being. Every material object is exactly itself different from every other material object. And yet it's all unpatterned radiance at the same time. And there's no contradiction there. So logically that's just like, tilt. But exactly. But so this is the real hurdle in this yoga, is to get to the experiential verification that intense paradox is simply self-evidently the case, and then no problem. But it's an absolute mystery. I mean, it's certainly ponderable, and it's certainly fascinating. A fascinating aspect is just the nature of differentiation, the nature of the way all the radiant patterns are so different from each other and so unique, and holographically. So if you look at the pattern on any level of scale, you still find uniqueness. My left hand is not like my right hand. This part of my fingernail is not like that part of my fingernail. They each have their uniqueness and their specificity.
Yes. And yet, there's persistence.
Yeah, but that's just karma. Well, there's apparent persistence, which again is the nature of the specificity.
When I look at my neighbor, I see the same. It's not the same energy, but I get the same taste.
It's recognizably similar.
It's recognizably
similar enough that you can there seems to have a consistency.
It's in the middle of a baseball stadium, I would be able to identify that.
Yeah. Right.
So it has this sort of persistence.
Absolutely, and that's part of the mystery of it.
Yeah. It's good.
The patterns have their apparent arc, their trajectory.
I have a question. Well, it's just that if this person was to suddenly become aware, his or her energy will change in my perception.
Right.
And so there's persistence, and there is permeable.
Well, it's permeable, and it's also the persistence is a matter of degree. It's a persistence within limits, because in actual fact, there's absolute variability and absolute non-repeatability, which is another aspect of it. So it's very subtle the way this works, and of course, again, it's not an either or, but all of these observable aspects are clearly observable and clearly in evidence, but they don't cohere into anything that makes any sense.
I mean, it's like when I taste watermelon, if it's a good watermelon, bad one, still watermelon.
Yeah, and you can tell it's watermelon and not chocolate or dog shit or what have you.
Every time.
Yeah.
I'm good with that.
So here I have a question from the chat room.
Question from the chat room. All right.
So we would like to know what you think about imagination.
Imagination is wonderful.
Not as interpretation, but as a field of experience.
Sure. Imagination is just that. It's a field of experience. It's an arbitrary bandwidth of the radiance. The radiance can look like imagination, just like it can look like thought, or it can look like vision, or it can look like anything. Yeah. And the imagination is fascinating. It's more because of its fluidity. Every aspect of the radiance evidence is absolute fluidity, but like John observed, in terms of the relative apparent consistency, certain bandwidths have a sort of a more subtle fluidity, even though it's absolute, and certain bandwidths have a much more explicit fluidity. Like, for example, thought or imagination is more fluid. There's been many metaphysical systems which have theories of sort of degrees of density of the subtle energy, where sensory energy is relatively dense, and then you get up into imagination, then you get up into thought, and then you get up into very subtle thought, and then so and so and so and so. And that's perfectly viable way to look at things. But but to my way of thinking, that's an unnecessary categorization. Just just the radiance can look like anything but never departs from itself. It includes all of that without trying to categorize it or hierarchize it. Because there's nothing better or worse about these different degrees of density. They're all radiance, and the radiance can show up like that.
I think a lot of people get sort of confused with the word or the idea of imagination because of a sort of disposition to discount it, and people say, "Oh, that's just your imagination."
Yeah,
of course, it's just my imagination.
But that's using it as a basis for interpretation. See, that's based on theories that mentality can have something to do with some objective reality. But the radiance completely levels that playing field and says nothing is about anything. Everything is just itself. So imagination is about the presence of imagination energy. Vision is about the presence of vision energy. And if you look at it that way, you see the way it's all the same thing, even though each relative portion of the bandwidth clearly has a different sort of a texture or a different, whatever we can classify various ways, different subtlety, different fluidity, whatever. But it's all the same thing. It happens in the same way. And then you can find the common denominator of the nature of the radiance.
Well, you talk often about how we're sort of brainwashed from an early age, and that's one of the main ways that parents, teachers, whoever, start brainwashing children. They start discounting their imagination and insisting that they pick out something objective.
Well, the whole fantasy of objectivity and objective stability and objective actuality as more relevant, important, or true as subjective presence, is part and parcel of human delusion.
That's interesting.
What's that?
That's an understatement.
Yeah.
You said we find the nature of the essence of the food.
What about, sorry?
You said we find the nature of that essence of food.
Yes.
It sounds like there's life there. I know you can't say when you do it, but I never heard you talk about that you come in and the nature of the essence of it.
Well, the nature of the essence of radiant presence is best describable in terms of the way I have designated it as radiant presence. Anything more I say about it is less accurate than that, and that's not particularly accurate. But it's at present it's the most accurate semantic reference that occurs to me in terms of really hitting the nail close to on the head. I mean, obviously you could talk about it forever, and we do. Anything every human being has said is actually about the nature of being present. There's nothing else to talk about. But to get to the most comprehensive, most essential aspect of it, it is radiant presence. Yeah. And well, it is the experience of itself. That its being is the experience of itself. You could say it is experience, but it's not. But it's not that it is experience. Is that experience is it? And of course, everything in experience is it, because everything in experience is experience. Everything in experience turns out to be experience, of course, and experience turns out to be radiant presence. The problem with stopping with experience is experience has subtle implications of an experiencer and experience and all of this stuff. Whereas radiant presence doesn't have a subject, doesn't have an object, doesn't have a location, doesn't have anything. It's just present, which is just present. Here it is, his presence. It's self-evident what that is. And radiant, i.e., it shows up endlessly as opposed to apparent qualities, experiential qualities.
I like this.
Well, this is good, but it doesn't convey much content. Radio present conveys a little more content without being too inaccurate. But it's arbitrary. The point is, it itself cannot be referred to except by it itself, because then you create a caricature of it, which will in some ways have erroneous implications at best, if not be outright confusing at worst. And it's confusing enough in its nature. It's the mother of all confusion. Because it's so paradoxical in its very nature. I mean, this is why people get so bewildered about it, because it's so intrinsically paradoxical. It's one thing, and yet it looks infinitely different than itself. What do you do with that? I mean, how weird could you possibly be? It's not as or not as. It's just it is itself. It's infinite. It presents as infinitely differentiated within itself, and it is always, but it never departs from itself. Don't know.
That sounds like the same thing.
Okay, well, if it's the same thing, then sure. I don't know. Maybe our minds just work differently. Nothing anyone says is actually precise or accurate, so it's unimportant when people put things in different ways. No, at best. I mean, we try to be articulate.
What would be a generic term for pattern that covers everything that's pattern?
One.
Because relating to the vision
Structure.
You can see patterns. That's obvious.
Mm-hmm.
But you move into other dimensions, just hearing, feeling, imagining. I don't know what defines a pattern.
A pattern is anything that's differentiable from anything else. Mm-hmm. So if there's a dot of light existing in a vast area of darkness, that's a pattern, because the patterning is the fact that the dot of light is differentiable from the other. Or if there was a line appearing, that's a pattern because the portions of the line are differentiable from other portions of the line, and they're differentiable from the background, which is non-line. So anything which is anything relative to something that is relatively not it is patterning. You could say patterning is a field of differentiation. A field of let's say a field of differentiability. How about that? That's a little more open, a little more radical. A little more radical. It's a field of differentiability.
You're still giving something to hope.
Well, yeah. That's inevitable. I get that well.
Even saying it's a pattern seems to take it away from what it is.
Yeah.
Really,
No, anything. As soon as you talk about something, you're spinning inaccuracies, because everything is just exactly itself. And to see what anything is, it itself is the only thing that is what it is. And so if you want to see what anything is, see what it is. And as soon as you talk about it or think about it or draw a picture of it or anything like that, you're departing from it or partializing it or caricaturizing it or what have you, which inevitably will introduce inaccuracy or distortion.
But there is no distortion.
Right. The distortion is it too.
Everything is.
Right. But when you're at the level of patterns, patterns are differentiable from each other, even as they are the same as each other. And so it's important to be with every aspect of that continuum to really get what it is. So the distortion is actually either going into another pattern or smearing out from that pattern into its context, which of course is a part of the pattern. These patterns, or the nature of patterns is they don't exist in isolation, they really exist in context, which is of course part of the pattern. Yeah, it's all, that intelligence is the whole, the motive, let's say the motive force or the functional aspect of differentiation of pattern.
Yeah, I mean, I it feels to me like intelligence is pattern.
Absolutely. Intelligence does the patterning. Intelligence perceives the patterning. You know, intelligence analyzes the pattern. Every aspect of it is intelligent.
That's where that both being and perceiving is the sense of intelligence starts to change.
Yeah. Sure. The flavor of patterns, the functionality of patterns, it's all just, latent display of intelligence. That a biological system can seem to function ongoingly is inconceivable. Intelligence is just showing off. That anything can have the coherence that it does is intelligence showing off. The laws of physics, atomic structure, like that. That wood that's been turned into a sculpture hanging up there. That it is the way it is, and that it has the consistencies that it does, i.e. that the molecules and atoms all resonate with sufficient tolerances within that pattern, is pure intelligence. I mean, how can that happen? How does it, how can structure work? And not that it is working, but even the apparition of working is intelligence. And the perception of the working is the intelligence. It's not so much about that in the wood. I mean, I could be dreaming about it, and it's the same intelligence. It's that the pattern has the degree of coherence that it does, and the degree of metamorphosis that it does is all a show of this astounding intelligence.
You look at anything.
Yeah, exactly. Because it's all the same. I mean, all patterning is of the same nature. I mean, every pattern is different than every other pattern, but what they are and how they work and what they're made of is all the same, which is, radiant presence, whose nature is transcendental intelligence. Hence all this. To the extent there's in all this. Berkeley girl, I can't stand the heat, man. In Palm Springs, you'd say this is a lovely, cool day. No, it's not. I didn't bring the wire for that. I could have done that because you probably have an audio. Yeah, I will. Did you have a wire for it? Do you have a wire for it? I plugged it in.
Oh.
I'll bring it one next time. I'm so used to my computer doesn't have an audio in, so I'd be able to call it to bring it in.
Yeah.
But if your computer has that, I'll definitely bring it on this one.
It sounds okay. You sound fine.
Well, yeah, I'm right next to it.
Questions are anything nothing.
Yeah, just everybody yell.
All right. He's having trouble with the sound, is he?
Stage
this one
whisper.
goes out to you, Jeff.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up.
That's the answer to everything.
I just think you said,
So right on.
whenever you say intelligence, Peter, I always get stuck in the duality because there's a designer. Now, how is intelligence without there being that which is intelligent?
Well, that's why I call it inherent intelligence. So it's the intelligence which is the very nature of being. In Satchidananda, it's the chit. So it's not a sub functioning of anything, or a byproduct of some mechanism. It is intrinsic in the very nature of being, of reality itself, that it is functioning intelligent.
So it's doing itself intelligently.
Yes.
But then how do I determine what does intelligence mean?
Well, it doesn't mean anything. You can't define it because it's transcendental, but it's indicative because what we ordinarily think of as intelligence meaning, if that is suggestive of what this quality actually is, even though the quality will utterly and ultimately transcend any definition of what, or idea of what the word intelligence means. But our word intelligence is a jumping off point to sort of catch the pinky of the thing itself and follow it into its nature, which being transcendental can't be explicated.
It started with this question, started with the central pattern of form. I said, intelligence.
Yeah.
Form is intelligence.
Yeah, form is intelligence. Form is, any way you look at it. Form is perceived by intelligence. Form is maintained by intelligence. If it's, any way you look at it, you find intelligence. If you think of it as physical, then the laws of physics are intelligent. If you think of it as mental, then the functioning of mentality is intelligent. Intelligent as opposed to stupid, random, inert, noise. It's not like that. It's an incredible sort of a pseudo or virtually purposeful structurality that is apparent. And that is the implication of intelligence. Picture, as a metaphor, you might picture, a random, a meteor falls to Earth and shatters into a billion pieces and just scatters itself randomly. Or you might picture someone very carefully taking pieces of rock and arranging them in a really intricate pattern. Okay. Not that that's a metaphor, so it's evocative. But it's the structure, so you find more chaos and less explicit order in the random destructive event, but in the sort of intelligent placing event, you find more explicit order and perhaps functionality, because they might take the rocks and build a machine out of them or something. And so likewise, you look around and you don't find just blobs and flashes and random squiggles. You find these amazingly pseudo-coherent, bodies and structures and objects and things that behave very, very specifically according to very intricate seeming patterns and natures and physical laws and what have you, which is a far cry from just random static or fuzz that one might expect on a less ordered, a less intelligent ordering principle.
And is there a law here that there is no chaos?
No, absolutely not. Chaos is a fundamental mode of the intelligence.
So you really think that
but it's not exclusive. It's not either or. It's not just chaos or order.
Right.
Chaos is a mode of order.
So intelligence includes
Everything.
chaos.
Yeah, all patterning, including chaotic patterning, is evidence of intelligence.
All patterns is chaos.
Yeah, and all patterning is chaotic, but it's chaos with sort of high harmonics of suborder within the chaos. So a biological system, for example, is a chaotic system of atoms, and ultimately fails, right, due to its own chaoticness. And yet there's a pseudo orderliness to it that generates the illusion of functionality for 80 years or whatever. So it's a sort of a harmonic of order within the chaos. So you're always within a continuum of chaos and degrees of order, and it's not an either or. It's not like it's in one state or another state. It's always in all states.
I have a feeling, or the thought is not clear, that the intelligence of any system was really be defined or would be defined as intelligence only from the point of view of the whole.
From any point of view, if a system is a system and has any degree of functionality whatsoever, i.e. any degree of structure, then that's intelligent. And then from a point of view, that becomes the case as well. But for a system to be a system, it has to be from a point of view, even a hypothetical point of view.
There's an amazing degree of intelligence and order in DNA.
Yeah, good.
Beyond what anybody can possibly conceive.
Good.
And it's just awesome.
Yeah. On every layer, on every level of scale, you find this astounding, inconceivable structurality. Structure and incredible functionality on the atomic level and the subatomic level and molecular level and biological level. These astounding, systems that have intensely specific behavior and natures interacting with each other according to those natures. I mean, it's just, all of that is what I would group under this category of intelligence.
Possessions of intelligence go all up to the highest state of realization that a person can have.
Of course.
So the truth you still can pick out intelligence as opposed to just.
Of course. Well, pick out is the wrong way to put it. You can't pick out anything. But it comes with. What intelligence refers to, which is inherent in the absolute, state, is there. Realization is not a change of condition. It's just noticing what is the condition.
Intelligence doesn't fall off at something.
No.
It's not a function of more attention.
No. Intelligence is inherent. Intelligence is not a byproduct of anything. Intelligence is not generated by anything. What this is intelligent.
What intelligence is
it.
You just have to wait.
Well, you can look and see. Just look at the way this is, and that's intelligence. The radiance is astoundingly, seemingly purposeful and functional. It turns out all this it turns out this amazing product. I mean, look at this. Hollywood is drooling. Hollywood wishes it could do what reality effortlessly does everywhere. Yeah. And the radiance, just the nature of what the radiance is doing all this. So it's inconceivably productive and functional.
But it just seems, in my case, just growing up from a child, I recognize the intelligence of things as I became more mature.
Right.
The younger I could imagine, remember myself, it was just an amorphous sort of experience.
Perhaps, yeah. But even when it's amorphous radiance, it's never absolutely amorphous. Mm-hmm. And even if it was absolutely amorphous, that's a kind of order itself, a kind of ordering itself, a kind of pattern. Mm-hmm.
So intelligence is form.
Yes, sure. You could say intelligence is form. That's a good way to put it.
I wouldn't put it as form. Conversation.
Yeah, but I mean that's a good way to sum it up. That word. I'm very arguing with that.
But it's still inherently inaccurate.
Well, yeah, but anything you say is inherently inaccurate. So that's a given. So Yolande, where are you? We need you. Shut us up. And yet inaccuracy is the radiance too. Inaccuracy. The radiance, one of the radiance's major modes is inaccuracy.
Here has a question about discrimination.
Yeah.
It says, how, let's see, how can we use our discrimination to directly know the difference between eternal and non-eternal, reality and non-reality?
Very easy. Anything that seems to be any particular way that's a sign of non-reality, i.e., of confusion, of misinterpretation, because reality itself, the very nature of anything that is actual, is infinite, i.e., exists simultaneously in infinite different ways. Any of which would seem to be might seem to be contradictory if you pick them out and isolate them. So anything that seems to be one way as opposed to some other way, that's an example of oversimplification, which is the mechanism of delusion, of confusion, of misinterpretation. Because actuality is not simple in a conceptual sense. Nothing actual can be accurately held to be this or that, and actually held to be any particular way, without infinite caveats. Yeah, it goes around everything. So to make it simpler, anything that seems to be anything, discriminate against it.
Yet that seeming to be everything is, as we just discussed, is pattern.
Yes.
Is itself.
Exactly.
And so that's shining through everything that seems to be
Yes, except the inherent intelligence is infinitely multivalent. The inherent intelligence can be with things not being one way. And yet the inherent intelligence also is what's doing, ultimately, the misinterpreting, holding things to actually being one way, i.e. oversimplifying it. But the inherent intelligence itself doesn't need to do that. It is quite comfortable, but in a human mode, it collapses down to holding things to be a certain way. And when you get to a transhuman mode, then it's quite comfortable with infinities. It can be with things contradicting themselves.
Yeah, it's that comfortable with infinities.
Yeah. Yeah, that's it. Yeah, so anything that seems anything less than infinite, discriminate against that sucker. Back of the bus.
But I don't know. I mean, it seems to me that anything like that, it seems like you could sort of leave it there, I suppose, stop looking at it, but you just touch it with attention, with interest.
Right. And that's that's discrimination. That's discriminating between inaccurate misinterpretation and the actuality as it is, the experiential presence.
To me, it's just engaging.
Sure.
I want to see what you mean by discriminating.
It's wafting with extreme prejudice the sword of Manjushri. I mean noticing, yeah. I understand. Choose your metaphor. Metaphor is at 20 paces.
Spontaneity seems to imply the immersion in creating things.
Yes, they're one and the same.
As opposed to watching.
Well, spontaneity is the actual condition, which is radiant presence. And anything other than spontaneity is a fantasy of other than spontaneity, because there's actually nothing other than spontaneity. Because all event, such as it is absolutely spontaneous. So spontaneity is simply actuality, i.e. radiant presence. And the idea that there's anything other than spontaneity is a fantasy, or an inaccuracy, or a heavy-handed oversimplification or interpretation, which itself is spontaneous and occurs in spontaneity, paradoxically.
You could say watching is spontaneous.
Of course.
So it seems to be distinct from spontaneity itself.
Not really. No, not really, because if you look at watching, it is spontaneously what it is, the way it is, moment by moment, with absolute uniqueness and non-repetition, and so on and so on and so forth, and absolute what's the word? Unexpectedness, where you can't tell what it's going to be. It's surprising, which is a hallmark of spontaneity. So to hold that there is a watching which is not that, not those qualities, is again a fantasy. So there can be what you're calling watching, but even that there is watching, it's itself a fantasy, because as compared to what? Experience is continually a watching. But you can't isolate any watching from any non-watching. So that watching is even watching is already a heavy-handed oversimplification. To experience is to watch in a profound, integral way.
Well, there's a kind of spontaneity that seems to lack awareness.
Sure. Oh yeah. Much spontaneity lacks awareness, but lack of awareness is just a kind of awareness. Awareness it comes in many different flavors, let's say. There's nothing but awareness, so unawareness or lesser awareness is just awareness in another guise. Unconsciousness is just consciousness in another guise, in another flavor. Another one of its modes, you could say. Yeah, it's not even pretending, it's just presenting with a characteristic that we call unconscious, which from its point of view is perfectly conscious.
You can call it anything you want.
Absolutely. That's one of my favorite words. Groucho.
guess I was afraid of watching stuff.
Right. It could be held to be that way. But again, anyone is holding it that way, that very holding is itself interpreting, which is inaccurate. Or let's say not completely accurate. Inaccurate doesn't mean wholly inaccurate, it just means not completely accurate. In this case, and this is as good as mine. Mostly right means entirely wrong.
Well, we talked about that as important.
Yeah, exactly so.
So, we're watching from the viewpoint of self-interest.
Right.
Which is where a lot of most watching is.
Yes, but you have to look at this a little more subtly. Watching, what can be called watching from the viewpoint of self-interest, can actually be occurring and not be that at all, just be radiance being one of its modes. So radiance doesn't exclude anything. Everything is actually radiance without needing to not be what it seems to be. So watching doesn't need to not be watching because it already isn't watching because it's actually radiance. So whether watching or non-watching is happening, the difference isn't whether it's happening. The difference isn't whether self-interest is there. The difference is whether it's known to be radiance or not. Sure, you can say, yeah, sure. I mean, known is itself a transcendental quality, so you can't pin it down. I mean, the difference between realization and not realization, you can't specify ultimately exactly what that refers to. And yet it's an actuality that can be engaged. So self-interest is not excluded from radiance. Self-interest and striving for individual advantage and all these kinds of things are modes of radiance. And the problem isn't their existence or not. The problem is whether or not you see that they are radiance or not. That's it. Radiance doesn't need to be in one mode or another. Any mode whatsoever is a mode of radiance, and so there's no problem with any mode. I mean, you've heard me say that you can be a serial killer. A serial killer can be realized because, of course, being a serial killer is just a mode of radiance. Well, how else could it exist? Don't try this at home, folks. We're trained professionals.
There's only one here.
You'll be receiving your disclaimers and release forms in the mail. And simply by watching this video, you've explicitly agreed to.
Isn't there a code ring associated?
But that's just an absurd example. No, it's not really an absurd example. It's an extreme example. But so any mode. It's not the existence of the mode. It's not the existence of that mode of functioning or not. It's seeing that mode of functioning is radiant presence, or holding it to exist autonomously in some context that one is interpreting into existence. Like if there's a me and I exist in some environment, and I'm egotistically striving for self-advantage, and that's held to be a fact, then that's complete delusion. But if there's radiant presence, and radiant presence looks like me cutting into line somewhere so I get somewhere sooner, then that's just radiant presence.
I see. Oh! Blame it on radiant presence.
God made me do it. The voices told me to do it. And on that note, why don't we have a little chai break? So we'll be back in about 10 minutes. Online people, it's about 10 of 8. We'll be back around 8ish loosely, and we'll see you then. Or you'll see us then. I guess more.
It's funny how some nights it's just quiet. Some nights really.
Yeah, the energy is always different. Spontaneous?
It's just like a rip roaring as far as the explanation. Particularly good.
Oh, nice. That's right. Shall we resume? All right, we're officially resumed. Not that there's anything official about anything that happens here.
Change of scene.
Really took over your spot.
Yeah, very well.
I was saying, Dean, another way to put the whole issue of intelligence is in terms of information. Anything that has any degree of information is a sign of intelligence. So basically, anything that has any degree of patterning is a sign of intelligence, because in exactly what I mean by information, you probably need to get into information theory to try and pin down what that refers to. But that basically means anything that has content. A dot in space is information, is content, so it is information. The information is that there's a dot in space. Right? Even that there's nothing is information, because that's is itself a condition, and so intelligence is part and parcel of that. And any condition that has information is, of course, a pattern as well. So all of these different complexities of ways of referring to it are basically referring to the same thing. And the intelligence is what's doing that, and that is an evidence of that, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that's any more helpful or not. Anyway.
It's the age of data.
Yeah.
Data is everything.
I think that like part of the question of intelligence is in terms of what is sentient and what is not sentient. To me, that's a really neat.
Well, that's an abstraction. There's nothing but sentient, because there's nothing. Experience is sentient, and existence doesn't happen outside of experience, except as a fantasy within experience, which again is not outside of experience.
Well, in the sense of it's like looking at some planets and near that sun. What's occurring there seems, it feels to me like that is full of its own intelligence.
Of course.
As it is.
Of course, because it's an intense event, and all that eventfulness, all the content of that eventfulness, the specificity of that is being affected by intelligence.
But so I don't know. How would I know if there's any experience other than my experience?
Well, it's irrelevant. The other than is again a fantasy, and that's being bandied about with it's much too much philosophical abstraction.
But it's easy enough to see the intelligence of living things, but to me, to see everything that just is, as it is.
Well, the intelligence is as it is part.
Yes.
The fact that atoms know to be atoms, that a hydrogen atom knows to be a hydrogen atom, and knows to interact with an oxygen atom, and so on and so forth, and knows not to interact with a helium atom. It's like, how does that happen? And so, exactly, its nature is inherent intelligence. So nature is inherent intelligence, functionality. You could say structural functionality is inherent intelligence. So anywhere there's functional structure, which is anywhere there's structure, which is anywhere there's anything whatsoever, that's intelligence.
And we always try to find reasons.
Yeah, but that's just trying to collapse things down into some oversimplified explanations. None of this is explainable. Appropriate note to shut up on.
Is that the point all of these pathways associated silence?
Yeah, silence doesn't exclude speech. Speech is just another mode of silence.
So,
And all leads to radiant presence, which is beyond words and doesn't exclude words.
Or
I have a streaming chat room here on my page. Virtual people apparently chatting to each other. Of course, they think I'm a virtual person, so. Why not walk in?
A lot of people sleep without a technical question from Zogan nature. They use the word over and over, vajra.
Yes.
How would you define that in the context of the
Vajrasattva very specifically refers to the intelligent aspect of radiance. So it's a quality of dynamism that embodies information, content, intelligence, intelligent engagement, revelation, all those kinds of things. It's a personification. Vajrasattva is a deity form, but what it symbolizes, what it refers to, is this very specific, the intelligent aspect of radiance, of the active aspect of this here. In the same way that Samanta Vajra refers to the presence aspect, just present but not inclusive of all other aspects, but not explicitly the active or dynamic aspect of Vajrasattva.
And what was the point in creating these apparent divisions?
No point, just as teaching devices within this yoga of Sajjan.
Is that just sort of more like,
it's a code. Well, no, mate, it's a code. I mean, when faced with the challenge of how to convey this stuff over the ages, different people have come up with different strategies, and Dzogchen was one of actually the more direct and efficient strategies. But regardless of that, or that, irrespective of that, it does include a certain amount of metaphor and philosophical structure and technique that shows up in terms of these technical terms. So in order to interpret the code, so to speak, that these teachings are embodied in, you kind of have to know the technical terms and sort of know some of the mythology or metaphor that they use as their language. But it's just a matter of translation. I mean, we kind of do the same thing, only we're a little more free rolling with our metaphors, but it's the same, similar kinds of abstractions.
I mean, I do notice that even in these discussions in myself, there is a sort of progression of experience that seems to manifest as a certain thing over time. There seems to be a theme. I find myself looking at a certain area.
At different points in one's unfoldment, different aspects sort of come to the forefront and seem sort of themes of threads of relevance that run through various, aspects of things.
It's like I've been playing a lot with whether something means anything or not. Because nothing really means anything.
Right.
But people are looking at me really strange, because I'm looking at whether it means anything that whatever our interaction is, but they're looking at me like, what are you? And I'm even playing with that because that means nothing too. It just keeps going in this incredible spiral, which is really fun, actually. Fully entertaining, engaging all the time. It's really interesting.
But depending on your temperament or your nature as an energy system, you'll notice there are different degrees of being explicit in terms of manifesting your exploration of this stuff. I'm more internalized by my temperament, so I tend to, people around me don't necessarily know what I'm doing or what my state of mind is, but someone whose nature is more outgoing or connective, it might be a little more obvious, a little more out of the closet, so to speak.
Right. Well, it seems to me like I have people commenting on my state, but I don't have an awareness of that thing. So I mean, I find that's a little disorienting, because I'm just like, shit, I'm at work.
Right.
And I'm not sure about that disparity.
It's not important. I mean,
well, it doesn't feel good.
Oh, I see.
In me, like I may not be feeling good about what's going on, but other people don't seem to be noticing that.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is an aspect of energy systems is no matter how explicit or not you think you're being, all energy systems communicate their state nakedly and directly and are perceptible to people around them, depending upon how thick they are.
Right.
So let's call it.
Yeah.
Another technical term there. And so, so people will notice, where you're at, and if you're at somewhere that is by contrast with ways you've been at in the past, or by contrast with what other people expect, is a certain way that's surprising or noticeable or noteworthy, regardless of what you're focusing on in terms of your own standards. Because again, remember this very strange phenomenon in spirituality. It's very difficult to self-assess, because as you evolve in functionality or unfoldment, you also evolve in sensitivity. So you may seem to be as fucked up and as incompetent or as troubled by your own situation as you ever were, whereas in actual fact, the objective state of your functionality may be wildly increasing, but you may not appreciate it or notice it because it will feel very much the same, because as it increases, your sensitivity also increases.
Right.
So any degrees of disjunction or noise in the system will be glaringly apparent. It's Princess and the Pea kind of thing,
Well, I mean, there seems to be sort of my reliance on external reflection as well.
Right.
So, I come here and I'm never I'm staring at the wall. But
Sure.
if I'm in a certain environment, then I immediately take that to be the way things are when in fact everything is going on.
Well, that's part of probably your temperament and the way you function. You've probably always done that to some degree, I imagine.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Because again, as your sensitivity increases, your sensitivity to your own native energy states increases as well.
Right.
And so you'll notice these things where before you would have been oblivious, perhaps. Now, we become sort of hypersensitive to our own energy condition. So again, but it's all better off in terms of getting an accurate sense of it.
It doesn't mean anything. It's just interesting to know that. As far as strategy goes, I take the strategy of like they say, then I should not put myself in situations that towards me. I mean, that's part of what I've done in the past is to avoid situations where I feel that sense of discomfort. Or, I don't know whether that's relevant or.
It's a matter of practicality or convenience. I mean, if you like to avoid situations like that and you're able to, why not? Who cares? It's all the same. And if you're unable to, then you just cope with it. And it's probably not very different than it's ever been.
I just feel like it's terrible that my own experience. Yeah. I think it is.
Yeah.
As it is, as it's happening.
Welcome to infinity. Are we coming or going?
Ooh, yeah,
is this the beginning or the end? Is this happening or not? Huh? All transcendence, yeah. I'll bet you're right. That's the fun thing about transcendence. The thing about transcendence is you can't pin down what the fun thing about transcendence is.
I think maybe to the point that there's still a sort of pattern of judging or trying to locate a place on experience in some way.
Sure.
In relationship to some category or some district that I think is relevant, but it's all so broken down, just like so ready to be done. I think I'm never
and this is kind of an ongoing constant in the unfoldment process. Is there's always some degrees of shadow of habitual modes of orienting that are residually there, with ever diminishing but ever present degree of dominance or predominance in experience. So even as when one has essentially transcended all these outmoded ways of orienting, the echo or shadow of these modes still will show up and rear their ugly head, so to speak, or beautiful head, depending on how you want to spin it. And it's just a constant equation. Personality is the nature of personality. Personality is like a perhaps pesky and perhaps endearing dog that is continually following along one's heels forever.
Can you speak about invisibility?
Sure. You know, invisibility means not noticeability, and you know, this is something that is by degrees is the nature of patterning. You know, kind of in a comic, moment by moment manner. I guess that wasn't very informative. But visibility is noticeability, and what's visible means what's being noticed. And how that works and what that consists of is ultimately mysterious, as everything is. And yet it's an observable aspect of things. So, you know, some patterns intrinsically may be more invisible, or from time to time more invisible, just because of their nature in the context of the relative context they find themselves in. What's up with that?
Well, I think that it's sort of, I'm saying that it's sort of reflected in that question that I was asking earlier, to do with having things near it more visible versus, you know, they're not being visible, and some dependence on that in order to confirm that what I'm experiencing is in fact true or not.
Right. Yeah, but it's always a conundrum.
Yeah. In what way?
Well, in the sense that it's never clearly one way or another way.
Right. So at some point it's a wash.
Yeah, you just get more and more comfortable with ambiguity.
Yeah.
You know, more and more comfortable with, I don't know. What do you think? And I don't know.
Well, it may be interesting to notice too in which areas that he is. You know,
yeah, no, for sure.
Still, you know, in terms of there being some head bashing.
Yeah, because as with anything that seems to be a certain way, and in any sense at all, is a sign of some degree of not noticing.
Right.
A sign of some degree of perhaps subtly, but at any rate, actually holding things to be a certain way, which is an invitation to do some noticing.
Right. So, in fact, maybe the approach in that circumstance is to go ahead and look more closely.
Absolutely, always.
As opposed to, you know, find factual.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it doesn't matter, because when you go out the back door, you'll find the same thing as you'll find when you look more closely. But the point is to do something.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, the whole sort of cutting edge of the yoga is anything that seems like something, look and see that it's not. Look and see there's more and other than what it seems to be.
Including invisibility.
Including anything whatsoever. Anything that seems to be any particular way differentiable from any other particular way to any degree whatsoever. You know, when you're in absolute unknowing, then that's home. And there's even absolute unknowing whether or not you're in absolute unknowing.
Well, it's interesting because the two look similar.
They do. Yeah, it's always a cutting edge. You always
the direction from which one is observed.
Yeah, you're always on that knife edge. Forever. Yeah. And then it's a continual engagement.
seems like there's, countless ways that to suspend belief in something. It seems to be in one particular way that I've discovered. I mean, you use this word a lot, but I mean, a trick, so I was just tricked. Because, I mean, aren't I doing that just all the time anyway, whether I know it or not?
Sure. And the point of all these tricks is to discover the intrinsic open-endedness and unstuckness of this actuality. And the tricks are just instances of proving that or demonstrating it. But as one exercises or engages these tricks more and more frequently, it becomes clearer and clearer that this openness and unstuckness is more and more intrinsic. And so it sort of becomes just an ongoing verification of what is so, obviously intrinsically the case. And so then basically the degrees of stuckness or degrees of things seeming to be any particular way just may persist forever, but they just get subtler and subtler and subtler and subtler. And one's certainty in the intrinsic openness and unstuckness gets subtler and subtler along with it. But you're always on that knife edge. It's always, there's always, you're always at the fork in the roads between interpretation and open-endedness.
Right, we were talking about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so it gets subtler and subtler as one's realization deepens, but still always that knife edge, because that's the very nature of this is that it's that both of those modes, let's call it, are always right here. Like
that's that famous quote, the fork in the road, and I took it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I took it and it led to the fork in the road.
Yeah.
You always take the fork and it always leads you to the fork.
Well, how does that knife edge show up for you?
Kind of an ongoing multidimensional presence of paradox, I guess would be a way to put it. There's always personal self and personal life and personal involvement and history in the context of absolute infinity and transcendence, and it's always that fork.
Right.
And those two never are not present. They don't. It doesn't ever. This is that and that is this, even though this is that and that is this. But that doesn't collapse them. That doesn't collapse the bifurcation.
But there ceases to be a conflict between.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, as realization gets deeper and deeper, then the conflict gets more and more of just a kind of a poetic paradox rather than an actual issue.
Yeah.
On coarser levels, it's a major nightmare, and then on subtler levels, it's slight issues, and on even subtler levels, it's just a weird poetic, anomaly or whatever, some kind of a, dynamic, what's the word, dramatic tension or something. But it's eternal. It's eternal because it's like the continual paradox between specificity and infinity that is always present continually in form. And it never, neither side, so to speak, ever wins. It's like you're always exactly between the past and the future, and you're always in the present, but there is no present, and the whole thing it's just this ongoing sort of a smear. Infinity presents itself as a smear, which presents itself as sort of two polar extremes, on any axis you look at or something. I mean, I'm sort of putting it sort of poetically.
No, but I mean, just having that awareness that never resolves.
Right. Unresolvability is the very essence of actuality. Actuality never collapses to this or that. It's completely open-ended, completely intrinsically paradoxical. The very nature of infinity is that it is divergent from itself.
No, I think part of that is the conflict that has wanting to go.
Of course. And this is
and to know that actually, in
right.
fact, they never will.
Right. Well, this is the cutting edge that one continually moves into as one unfolds, as one becomes more mature and being able to be with this is getting less heavy-handed and less, what's the word?
Well,
Hungry for
the setting out.
Getting an answer, resolving it.
Yeah, there's that sense of the explorer that, like, what you set out in a new direction. And perhaps then, it will be
new direction, there's a lot of new direction, but there's no perhaps then.
Right.
And unfoldment and maturity consists of just settling deeper and deeper into the certainty of that fact, of the fact of unresolvability. Nothing ever makes any sense. Nothing ever reaches a conclusion or resolves into some finality or some, coherent condition or any this that would be distinguished from that. It's always a maybe. Or maybe, I don't know.
It's always a what?
Maybe, I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
It's almost a physical thing, or a real.
Oh, it is.
The word's energy, but because it's just like almost like a blink of an eye. I could be here and then I'm there.
Sure.
Or just I'm not moving, but the energy in me is moving one way or the other.
Sure, always. And we feel it in the state of the body. The body's always slightly unresolved. It's always doing some degree of a little pulling on itself. It's like it never actually settles down into really being one this way or really being that way. It's always sort of.
Yeah.
Do I feel good or do I not feel good?
How they go like this,
Yeah, sure.
It can be like a sensory thing
Sure.
too, but.
That seduction of human body does something to seemingly without it doesn't seem to be correct.
But it's never actually resolved. It's just to a subtler level of tension or a subtler level of imbalance. Which relative to a course level feels like a settling down, but then once you sort of recalibrate to that level, you still find the same, basically, irresolution.
Well, it's like the eating certain foods or not eating certain foods. You feel relatively better than you do.
Sure.
It's hard to say.
Yeah, it's always
exactly
hard.
What.
That's the point. It's always hard to say because it's never ultimately clear whether this is this or that's that or not. Because it's always well, yeah, kind of, but not really. It's always yeah, but. Which is the symptom of this unresolvability.
How does that relate to reality and the body itself?
Well, because all of that is this. The instability is this. It's the very nature of this. The unresolvability is the very nature of this, and it never departs from that.
It just plows on.
It's always this present, this exact presence. It's never stops being this present. And exactly how this presence presents is always ambiguous.
Right.
And that's an absolute constant.
Yeah.
It's always presence, and it is never resolvable as being one way or another.
It's the ultimate paradox. Actually.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's the actual paradox. The important thing is the actuality. That's the presence. It is here. It is here now. It's real. It's actual. It's present. But having said that, what is present? I don't know. What do you think? Can't tell.
So it covers all bases.
Oh, of course, it is all basic. I mean, you could say it's the actuality of mystery. That's a pretty accurate way to say it, because it is absolute mystery, but it is absolutely actual. It's concrete. And all virtual resolvability, all apparent resolvability, if you look closer, turns out to be an actual unresolvability, an actual paradox, an actual mystery. That's why noticing always goes to openness. It goes to open-endedness. It goes to what feels like a lack of resolvability, lack of stuckness, a lack of definition as being this or that, without a loss of specificity, without a loss of presence. So noticing feels like an opening in actuality. But the opening quality of that is a loss of resolution as being a particular way, without a loss of specificity. And that's the real revelation in noticing. You can be with experience very, very specifically, and yet you find this openness in the specificity. You don't need to, because the naive fantasy and ignorance is you have to kind of, do escapist mode to find openness. But it's actually the other way around. That just leads to even tighter stuckness. Whereas when you go into the specifics, into the actual concrete presence of experience, that's where you find the true openness. And that's where liberation comes. Because in this unresolvability is also liberation, because it's, if things can't be resolved, there can be no stuckness. There can be no you that is stuck. There can be all these conditions that in their specificity might be problematic, all just dissipate in uncertainty. Wow. It is. It's very counterintuitive from a human perspective, because in human logic you think more specificity means more stuckness, and yet it's not like that. It's exactly the opposite. It's in the specificity of experience that you find the infinity of the openness. And that's why physicists were so surprised when they discovered the quantum phenomenon, because they were finally getting really, really specific. They were able to take really, really precise measurements of what's down there, and what they found was completely weird. Things made less sense the closer they looked, and they were able to look closer than ever before. And that's completely opposite of human rational, let's call it consensus reality thinking, where the closer you look, the more things tighten up. Actually, the closer you look, the more things open up. And we find this without, needing to be scientific in the sense of getting instruments. You find this experientially too. Experiences like that. And that's the whole trick, that's the whole mechanism of noticing, is to be very present with the specifics of experience, and you discover the actuality of unresolvability, the actuality of infinity, as opposed to a fantasy of infinity that you get from spacing out or taking drugs or something. It's the concrete presence, the actual presence of the experience that reveals infinity.
Last couple of days we've been talking about like the density of your energy. And I assume that means just sort of noticing what it actually is and not getting stuck in the interpretation of it.
Essentially, I mean, noticing what it is, but when you notice what it is, you notice that it is an intense participation with itself. It's always dancing with itself.
Right.
The dynamism of the energy is, I mean, the dynamism of the radiance is a self-engagement. Radiance is dancing with itself, which is what everything is.
Right.
And noticing leads to the discovery that radiance is dancing with itself. But in that discovery, then one is just participating in that dance, which one's always been doing nothing but.
Right.
But then it just because you're participating with it on more and more of a primal level.
Right.
So instead of being you with your experience, it's just the radiance dancing with itself.
Right. Yeah.
So it's, I mean, one discovers direct energy engagement. It's all about direct energy engagement. You know, experience consists of direct energy engagement, but interpretation obscures that and makes that not noticeable. You know, the actuality of all experience and all apparent functioning and all that is complete direct energy. Like when I move my hand, there's not like there's a me over here and there's some mechanism. It's like it's just a mystery of the continuum of functional energy transcendentally engaging with itself, which shows up as all this apparent action. And just experiencing itself is that. So seeing the visual field or experiencing a thought is essentially direct energy engagement. And what is engaging with what can't be found. And when you look for any of these whats, you find radiance. So ultimately, it all collapses down to radiance dancing with itself. It's not an actual collapse because it's never been anything but radiance dancing with itself. But the degrees of relating to it in terms of abstractions of it being this or that or the other, being you doing this or, you know, just collapses in relevance until you're more and more participating with just the actual fact, this dynamic, absolute, integral, most intimate participation of just, you know, this ongoing, miraculous, you know, consciousness / energy event.
Right. Yeah, because the observing, the seeing is going on all the time automatically.
It is an observing. It is a seeing.
Right.
The doing is a seeing. You know, is a knowing, is an acting, is a, you know, I mean, all these verbs are just the same verb.
We sort of like let the seeing continue the way it always has.
Sure.
And I mean, there's always these interpretations of what's going on, but that's pretty much like the fork in the road kind of thing.
Yeah, and the seeing is doing that. The radiance does the interpreting.
Right.
Yeah. So the interpretation is just more dance of the radiance dancing with itself. And all phenomena whatsoever on any level collapses to, or it doesn't actually collapse, but it seemed to be the radiance dancing with itself. And then the sub-phenomena just lose relevance as being anything in particular, except radiance dancing with itself. And so there's just one thing happening here, which is radiance dancing with itself, which shows up in all this apparently, vast variety of different spread out textures and dimensions and all that, all of which is just radiance dancing with itself. So it essentially unifies itself around the single fact of what it actually is, and has always been, but there's no limit to how directly this can be seen and known, and the more directly it's seen and known, the more directly it's participated in on that primal level that it's being seen and known at.
Right. Seeing and knowing is participation.
Yeah. Because the seeing and the knowing is the participation. It's the participation is doing the seeing and doing the knowing.
Right.
So it all just bundles into itself. It's like a whirlwind that sucks everything in.
Right. Yeah.
And not literally sucks it in because it's already sucked in.
Right.
But it collapses into itself when it's seen. The more clearly it's seen to be what it is.
Right. Yeah. I notice if I wake up in the morning, I have a great deal of interpretation going on.
Mm-hmm.
I just try to see that and say, hey, look, this is to myself, this is a transcendental event here.
Yeah.
And it's your job to start seeing it that way.
Sure.
You can't.
Yeah. The shortcut is always just go to the energy. Go to the radiance that any experience on any level whatsoever is actually made of.
Right.
So if there's something being experienced, that means something is present, and regardless of how you're categorizing it, what is it that's present? And then right away you'll be with the energy of what it is. Right. And the energy of what it is collapses to, or turns out to be, nothing but raw radiance.
Right, yeah.
And so it all just continually goes back to the primal substance that it actually is.
Right, yeah.
The primal energy that it actually is.
Right. It seems like the discomfort in life is like interpreting this in a certain way.
Yeah, misinterpreting. And any interpreting is misinterpreting.
Interpreting gets radiant.
Yeah. Well, if it's interpreting, sure.
Yeah. So, if you're being with energy as it is, that's what's going on.
Exactly.
It's not radiance, maybe it's just itself.
Yeah. I'm talking about itself. Radiance means itself.
Yeah, right.
It doesn't mean, it's itself, but it has to be radiance, so you're holding it as radiance. No, radiance is just a euphemism for what it actually is. So, radiance is just a diving board into the thing itself. Forget about words and qualifications. And yet they come with. You don't need to cease them because they are the radiance too. Or they are the this too. And that's a nice thing. There's no opposites to it. There's no problems to it. There's nothing you need to not do.
That's a really weird.
Yeah, it is. It is. When you see it, it swallows. Yeah, it swallows all qualities and reveals them to be itself. And since they are itself, how can they be a problem to it? They are the evidence of it, not in any way antagonistic to it. They are the harmony of it in any degree of apparent disharmony. Apparent disharmony is just actual harmony.
Right. Well, that knife edge is always, it's sort of like it's always there.
Yeah.
It seems like it's going there sometimes in the morning, but it's like always there. It's constant.
It's like, is the electron a particle or a wave?
Yeah.
Well, that's the knife edge right there. And it's never going to collapse down to one or the other. Really. It seems pretty direct to me. You know, I mean, it seems it's a euphemism, of course, but it seems pretty nakedly evocative, especially by contrast to the indirect engagement that we fantasize about and all the incredible Baroque structure of self and other and action and medium of action and, you know, and result and resolution and conclusion and inception and all these apparently disparate elements of a transaction, none of which actually exist, whereas it's all just immediate direct energy engagement. All that diversification just collapses into the intermediate fact, which turns out to include any and all modes. So it's, you know, it's a nice, lovely oversimplification.
Well, what is a knife edge? I mean, is it transcendental too? I mean,
knife edge is this.
It's really weird.
It's transcendental. Of course, it's transcendental. You can't say what it is.
Right.
Anything actually, you can't say what it is. Yeah. You know, and the knife edge ultimately is this or that, and it's always this or that. It's always, I don't know.
Yeah, it's really
it's your.
I think it's a common mistake that I hear in, you know, of seekers is they want it to be one way.
Of course.
They want it to be. I don't know what the term is. You know,
yeah. And it turns out they're right. It is one way, but the one way is anyway.
Yeah.
Which is the way.
Well, it is different from.
I think so. I like it. I like it.
It is. I mean, the biggest term uncertainty sort of approaches that.
Sure.
But even then.
Well, all these ways of putting it have problematic implications because of the nature of the semantic structure. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, the whole mode of human logic is, you know, just a big train wreck. So best not to get too bent out of shape about it.
Yeah, right. But I mean, I recognize what you're talking about. I think that's about all I can say.
But that's the point, you know, she use language to evoke actuality without expecting it to be reciprocal.
Yeah.
Language can indicate reality, but it can't capture it. A sign can indicate a place, but it can't be the place.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sure. Evoke. Sure. Sure. Yeah. And it evokes it by being it, actually, because language is, of course, nothing other than intelligence, and intelligence is nothing other than inherent intelligence, which is the radiance. So right away, it just collapses into itself. Or not. If it collapses into itself, or leaves people totally befuddled, confused, and pissed off. Which is radiant brilliance. Where's your sense of humor, guys? I'm going to need to sleep in mosquito net tonight.
No, that's a mosquito hospital.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'm going to try and build some window screens in basement. And if that doesn't work,
probably not.
I still remember being like 5 years old. My bedroom and my mom comes in with a big old bomb, you know,
Oh, we have
GDT.
It's good for you. Well, good night, online folks. We're off and running.
Yeah.
Or not? See you next time.
You can probably transcribe this evening.